Hello, thanks for watching. You're listening to the Degüello, and the Degüello is a mournful piece, as you can hear. It was originally played by General Santa Anna at the Battle of the Alamo in 1836, when 125 Texans defended the fortress of the Alamo against 3,000 Mexican troops. Santa Anna offered them to surrender. They said, "We never surrender." So Santa Anna said, "No surrender, no prisoners, we're going to slit your throats." And that was it. And so that's what the word Degüello means, is slit your throat or no prisoners. And over the years, the tens of years since 1836, it's gained some significance, especially in Texas, but in movies too. The movie The Alamo, I think it was 1964 is when it came out, starring John Wayne. Dmitri Tiomkin wrote the version that you're hearing now. He won the Academy Award. I don't know if it's for for this movie, but he's very, very skilled, and it's a very beautiful and mournful piece about the people who had no hope at the Alamo. And thus, I wrote about, in my second book, The Last Lieutenant, about the people who had really no hope in Corregidor. Corregidor, an island at the mouth of Manila Bay, kept the Japanese from using Manila Bay as one of their major stopover points, even though they had conquered most of the Philippines. So, and 11,000 people were stranded on Corregidor with no hope of survival. Roosevelt and Churchill had months before decided that if the Japanese did go to war against the Allies, against the Brits and the Americans, the Brits in Hong Kong and in Shanghai, and the Americans throughout the Philippines, Guam, and elsewhere, that there was no hope of rescuing them. So they said, we're going to have to give them up. They called it the Europe First policy, where the United States would defend Britain with everything they had so they could gain enough momentum to have the men and material arms to come back and fight the Japanese in the Pacific, which is what they did. So the first novel in the Todd Ingram series is The Last Lieutenant, and like I do with my books, I like to find unique events that people aren't really aware of in World War II. And of course, Corregidor is something that's almost entirely lost. Almost, to me, it seems like swept under the rug, because it was, with the fall of Corregidor, 11,000 troops, Philippine American troops on Corregidor, that General Yamashita insisted that Wainwright surrender the entire Philippine garrison, otherwise he would kill everybody on Corregidor. And Wainwright finally agreed to do that. So were captured. We're 135,000 Philippine American troops with the fall of Corregidor in May of 1942, the worst ever military defeat for the United States. But think about that. Maybe that's why it's been swept under the rug, because nobody really thinks about it. Anyway, so with that happened, we have a hero, an anti-hero really, Todd Ingram. He's the main character. He's a skipper of a minesweeper. The minesweepers out of fuel, so they can't go anywhere. They're anchored off Corregidor. The ship is bombed. He's ashore with the people ashore, part of the garrison with 10 of his members, and so it's his story for survival. They hear about what happened at Bataan. They see the bodies floating in the bay. They know that the atrocities were terrible at Bataan, and so finally, the Japanese are able to mount an amphibious attack on Corregidor one night, and they get troops and a tank ashore. And Wainwright's biggest worry was that if tanks got ashore and got inside Balinta Tunnel, a mile-long tunnel with laterals, with hospitals and stories and places, birthing areas, that they would fire into the lateral, killing people. So when this happened, he finally said, "I surrender." And that's how the Corregidor was turned over to the Japanese. So that night before they were supposed to turn themselves in, Ingram said, "I don't want to do this." And so he and 10 of his men jumped on a little 36-foot boat called the 51 boat, and they got it started and ran under the cover of night and escaped Corregidor, and over a period of time made it all the way through the Philippine archipelago to Darwin, Australia. And it's an actual escape by John Morrill is what really happened, and so I just mirrored his book. there are things about this that really amaze me about the Morrow's escape and how he did that. For example, they would motor by night, evading Japanese ships, and then in the daytime pull into a beach or a bank, and always, inevitably, natives would come down and give them food and everything else, and help them out with water, provision them, and they get away again. So that's how they made it. During their voyage, Ingram falls in love with an army nurse, and so that's going on. And the technical centerpiece that I spoke about earlier is really an interesting thing. That's what fired my mind. Was Corregidor was connected to Hawaii by a telephone cable, and Corregidor was a listening station, an antenna farm like we have in Imperial Beach, California. There were 20 of these listening stations around the Pacific Basin, which could angle in on the Japanese and find out what their ships are doing and everything else. And so that's what Corregidor was doing. It was essential to the United States because it was the closest to Japan, and they could get stronger signals or even signals from unknown bases that others couldn't pick up. So that's basically Todd Ingram's escape from Corregidor. Helen doesn't do too well. Helen Durand is his girlfriend, and she's stuck on Mindanao at the end of the book. So we'll find out what happens in the next one. So we come to the next book in the Todd Ingram series, and keep in mind that it's a series. They're standalone books. In other words, you don't necessarily have to read the one before or after to enjoy the one that you have in your hand at any one point in time. But still, it is a series. They're connected. And here, Todd Ingram is back in the United States. His weight has fallen from 185 pounds, he was a young athletic guy, to 140 because of the starvation they went through in Corregidor, along with a lot of other people. So he's back there just pooped out and having a lot of trouble. So they give him really easy duty until they can return him back to active situation out in the Pacific. This is what I wanted to do, and in doing some research on this, I found out an interesting fact, which was really a lot of fun. I read somewhere that the Soviet Union had a consulate in San Francisco, which is where I was going to have Todd anyway. This is amazing. How could they have that? But you know, you want to verify that and confirm it. So I called the State Department of Washington, D.C. And I talked to this young lady. I said, all I'm trying to do is, do you know if the Soviet Union had a consulate in San Francisco during World War II, specifically in 1942? I'll get right back to you. What's your number? This is in 1995 or 6, before the internet, before Google and all the rest of it. So we hung up. A week goes by, 2 weeks go by, and let's get the beard on it. What's happening? I called back, and like Hollywood, Washington, D.C. State Department is a great land of unreturned phone calls. She wouldn't call me back. Oh, wow. So then I had a thought, this is amazing. So I called the San Francisco Public Library. Research. Hi, do you have the San Francisco telephone directories there? Yeah. Do you have the 1942 telephone directory? Yeah. Could you look up and see if you have the phone address for the Soviet Union, the Soviet consulate? Yeah. Pages are flipping. Yeah, here we are, 2635 Divisadero Street, San Francisco, California. So they really did have a consulate there. That's all they needed. I started writing the book, and it's structured around the Soviets having a consulate there. The naval attaché is a fellow named, a very colorful guy named Edward Dezhnev, who we meet in later books too, but his sole purpose there is not necessarily backslapping and kissing babies, as it is to weed out people. They've heard about this thing called the Manhattan Project, who are at Stanford or who are at the Cal Livermore Laboratories, trying to get them and turn them for the Soviet Union. So I'm into this thing, the book's going well. About a week later, the phone rings. Mr. Gobel, yes. Kathy Upton up, the State Department, yeah. We have found out that there was no Soviet consulate in San Francisco during World War II. Thank you very much. My tax dollars at work. We hung up. So that's how that went, but we did confirm it, so it was good. I sent a friend up there to take a picture of that address, and here's, you see the photograph here, and it was a very good-looking building. The Americans kicked them out in 1946 when they would not let us have a consulate in Vladivostok. And then they came back in the 90s, under Clinton. They had a consulate again there, and then Trump kicked him out again, I think in 2016 or 17. So it's a seesaw type operation. So the work really is, Todd Ingram, one, is in San Francisco. He meets Admiral Spruance, who is a hero of the Battle of Midway. Spruance singles him out, invites him to a party, decorates him with a Navy Cross, orders in his hand, sends it right back out the Pacific, be executive officer of a destroyer going against the Battle of Guadalcanal. So Ingram sees, and you see through his eyes, the naval battles of Cape Esperance and of the Santa Cruz Islands, which are 2 of the 8 major naval battles in the Solomon Islands in 1942. At the same time, Dezhnev is trying to find out these Americans who he thinks he can turn. Helen's still at risk. She's with the resistance on Mindanao, and Dezhnev finds a way to expose her, and so it gets pretty bad. Todd finally gets a way to get to Mindanao and find her, and we hope it turns out well. So that's how that book works. The next book is When Duty Whispers Low, and we feature here, as I mentioned, looking at the other side, Japanese Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. And Yamamoto was the favored admiral of the Japanese Imperial Navy, much like Admiral Nimitz was to the Nimitz was for the U.S. Navy, or even Admiral Halsey. Admiral Yamamoto, a brilliant tactician, spent time in the U.S., great poker player, a gymnast, would do handstands, everything else. He is the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack. He's the one that put it together. 176 carrier-borne planes attacking Pearl Harbor, and depending on your point of view, a really brilliant attack, put 5 battleships in the bottom. And so here, Yamamoto is in Rabaul. Things are not going too well because they've lost the Solomons, they've lost Guadalcanal, and the Americans are driving up the Solomon Island chain to Bougainville. And so Yamamoto he's fallen under a cloud. He's trying to win Guadalcanal back, and so he's putting together another plan called I Go, which means another Pearl Harbor-sized attack on the Americans at Guadalcanal and elsewhere, where he can bomb the Americans out and take the island back and gain back his glory and his stature with the Japanese government. At the same time, it was interesting. I first started off because I was fascinated by this device called the proximity fuse. And I was in naval gunnery. I was a fire control director officer on board that ship that you saw. And 5-inch guns are the most popular guns in the fleet, and similar guns in the Army too. And so trying to figure out a way to shoot down enemy aircraft more rapidly and more accurately in particular. The proximity fuse is a fuse that's screwed on top of the shell itself, and it goes out of the cannon like that. And that setback energizes the battery, which energizes a mini radar set in the fuse as it heads toward the target. And if it comes within 75 to 50 feet of the target, it'll explode. And it'll send out a big ring of shrapnel, which is really devastating to the target, to the other aircraft, to where the first introduction of the fuse to the fleet I think it was in April of 1943, was 50% accurate. By the end of the war, April, May, and June of 1945, the accuracy of the proximity fuse was 80% kill ratio. It was astounding. And what was amazing about this device was that it only took 2 years to develop it. It was going on. So we have Yamamoto, we see his likes, his dislikes, his friends. He has a mistress, we see her, and on the other side, Todd Ingram is still the executive of this destroyer, and he and his friend Jerry Landa, they become tight friends. Jerry Landa is the captain of the ship, but Landa will not use proximity fuses as it was. A good friend of mine was on his tours at that time, and he didn't trust him. Oh, newfangled contraption, don't use those things. Well, land is kind of like that, and so they don't use them. They use the old contact fuse, the 18% kill ratio capability, and the ship is bombed, and the rear end of the ship is blown off, and they're in really deep trouble. The next novel in the Todd Ingram series is The Neptune Strategy. Todd is now a commanding officer of a destroyer. It's just one of the things he's always wanted. It's his bucket list. He's finally the captain of the ship, enjoying it immensely, and he's with a group of other destroyers out in the Battle of Marianas, where Spruance is retaking Saipan and Tinian, the 4 islands in the Mariana chain, and his ship is dispatched out some distance to act as a picket destroyer against Japanese airplanes. So they're steaming along. It's almost sunset, foggy kind of, and all of a sudden they're hit by a Japanese air attack. Boom, boom, bombs are going off, blasting away at them, etc. Bomb goes alongside, detonates right next to the bridge, blows up. Ingram is blown off the bridge and into the water. So he finally goes to the surface, and he sees his ship kind of staggering into the mist, and the guys are trying to put out fires. They have no idea that their captain is back there, and so pretty soon he's all by himself throughout the night, staying afloat, finds some wreckage, stays with that. Next morning, he's looking around and goes, what do I do? And then he sees a periscope. This is great. So the submarine surfaces. It's a Japanese submarine. So they pick him up and send him down. He finds out that it's a submarine headed for the U-boat pens of Lorient, France. Japanese submarines, interesting in those days, had long legs. They were slow, cumbersome vessels, but they had just amazing range capabilities. They go 6, 8, 10,000 miles on their diesel. So that's what these did. They're freight carriers, basically. And so the Japanese attempted a few times to exchange information, material, personnel with the Germans via submarine, because that's the only way they could do it. They couldn't do it by land, by air, any other means. So anyway, he's on this submarine that's going to Lorient, France, on the west coast of France to the U-boat pens. And he soon discovers that there's Yakuza gold aboard. These guys are really trying to do something else to put the gold someplace where they can keep it, because they know that Japan is going to lose. And so now it's Todd's job. He's trying to get off the submarine, and he has trouble doing that. In the meantime, his friend Jerry Landa is back in the United States, heading up an operation, which is amazing. In those days, the Americans were reading almost online the Japanese coded messages. And so Landa's there trying to make sure that the Allied ships and aircraft stay out of the submarine's way, because they know Ingram's aboard. And then they find out that the Ingram did not make it, that he was been killed. So we'll leave it there. And it has some interesting aspects to it. So thank you. Call of Colors is a novel I wanted to write about the Battle of Leyte Gulf. But there are so many elements in this book, I can't tell them all in the time that we have. But essentially, going on in the Pacific Basin were a number of things. One is that ships were blowing up, ammunition ships, just enormous explosions. Port Chicago up in the San Francisco Bay Area, the Admiralty Islands, another one up, and Westlock and Pearl Harbor, another one up. And when these ships go up, I mean, they are just disastrous. So much so that the DC-3 flying over the Port Chicago disaster in overcast, it was just an overcast, it was at night, they saw the clouds light up, what's going on? Like lightning or something like that. And all of a sudden this gigantic boxcar-sized, that's what they said, boxcar-sized chunk of molten metal went shooting through the sky. It was 2 ships that blew up, ammunition ships blew up. They were side by side at the pier, one of them so much so that they found the keel of one of the ships 150 yards away, turned the other direction. It was just a horrific blast. So that was going on. We found out there's a German saboteur. Also, Mike Donovan, a different character, is being suited up to command a destroyer that's going out to join the ships which will eventually be involved in the invasion of Leyte. His ship is is assigned to the group Taffy 3. There are 4 phases for that battle. Lady Gulf MacArthur successfully invades the Philippines and takes the Philippines back, starting with Leyte. The Battle of the Sibian Sea, in the middle of the Philippine archipelago, where they sunk the Japanese battleship Musashi. The second phase was the Battle of the Surigao Straits, where the Japanese tried to oppose the battle with 7 major ships coming through there, and they were all sunk. Third battle, which is a famous one, the Battle of Samar, very close to Leyte, where with 30 ships, including the Yamato, they tried to oppose the American ships at Leyte. As James Hornfisher said in his book, The Last Stand of the Tin Can Sailors, it was one of the United States Navy's finest moment. 6 destroyers assigned to light carriers turned and headed directly toward the Japanese attack force. 30 of them, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and just started shooting with torpedoes and everything they had. So there was that. The fourth phase was the Battle of Cape Engano, which was up north, a decoy force to pull the defensive forces away from the Leyte position. It demonstrates the fog of war, why Takao Kurita, the commander of the Japanese force off Samar, turned around unexpectedly and went back. He had MacArthur's ships under his guns, but then he did. So there's just so many things that went on in that particular phase that just amazed people. So that's basically it, and it's dramatized, but the actual events, the people, the ships outside of Mike Donovan, the destroyer captain, are real. At the same time, MacArthur was thinking of running for president against Roosevelt, and you'll have a chance to see Roosevelt and MacArthur meet and discuss their invasion plans for Leyte, so it's kind of exciting. We turn now to the very end of the war. Both bombs have been dropped. Ingram is, again, a skipper of a destroyer off the east coast of Japan when they're hit by a kamikaze attack. He has minor damage to his ship. They put into Karamaretto, and it was there. Karamaretto is a group of islands off Okinawa, and it's there that Hirohito sends out a surrender message to the world. I mean, everybody's amazed, happy. Guns are firing the night. It's just astounding that the Japanese signed unconditionally. Both the atomic bombs have been dropped, and so that's past him. So Ingram, like everybody else, thinks he's going home. Operation Magic Carpet, everybody jumps on a ship, go on home. But no, Ingram knows too many people in the Navy and the Army, etc. He has a vast knowledge of the Philippines and other areas. So they sign him up to join a delegation in Okinawa. Japanese sent 16 diplomats they chose to fly down to Manila to meet with General MacArthur's Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Richard Sutherland, and to discuss the terms for the surrender agreement, which were one, the place, which turned out to be the USS Missouri, the immediate repatriation of all Allied prisoners of war, British, American, Dutch, etc., and the immediate surrender of all arms and ammunition and people under arms in the Japanese Imperial forces. So that's what they discussed, and it came to pass. We see the surrender ceremony up close. Todd's invited to it because of the work he did on it. Todd, Jerry Landa, and his friends, and we can see there were only 2 signatories to the ceremony. The Foreign Minister Shigemitsu, the civilian signing for the Japanese Imperial Government, and for the Imperial Japanese Military, General Umezu. Only 2 out of the 11 diplomats they sent. So there was that, and it was interesting to see that and work through it. At the same time, the day after the Nagasaki bomb, which was August 9th, 1945, the Russians invaded Japan. Up to that time, they'd been neutral to the Japanese. All of a sudden, boom, surprise attack, came through Manchuria, just like through a knife through butter, took everything back, came down and took Sakhalin Island, which is just north of the Japanese home islands, and were poised to invade North Hokkaido. And Truman found out about this and said, "No way." So guess what? Todd gets sent back to Sakhalin Island to meet there and to see if he can help disperse the Soviets up there. One of the garrison commanders there is this fellow Edouard Dezhnev. You remember him back with Code for Tomorrow? So they meet, and this time Dezhnev has decided that he always loves the Russian state, the Rodina, as they call it, their beloved Russia, and he was always before in favor of saving her, but this time, so he's now beginning to work with Ingram and others in the OSS and CIA to work against the Russians. So that happens, and the battle at Sakhalin is interesting too, because the Japanese, once neutral to the Russians, now are fighting both the Americans and the Russians. So we got to see how that turns out. I got to toot my own horn for this book, that this novel won the gold medal for historical fiction in 2015 from the American Society of Military Writers. So we do like to see that. Anyway, okay, thank you. So we turn to the last book, the most recent book in the Todd Ingram series, and that is, we go beyond World War II. The title of that is Dead Man Launch. And Dead Man Launch comes from the fact that within the Soviet politique, as I can say, there is a code or a procedure that if all of the politicians and the ranking military are killed in a preemptory attack, that somehow a trigger is pulled and every missile in the Soviet Union, their entire armory, goes off against the United States. And there would be hundreds of them. They just ripple fire, go off one by one by one by one. And so American CIA analysts called that Dead Man Launch. That's how the book gets its title. And so there is a program in many submarines, Russian submarines, and other defensive mechanisms where they do have dead man launch switches where they think everything's going to go. So 1968 was a very, very dangerous year for the United States. And by that I mean politically and internationally. For example, Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. Martin Luther King was assassinated 2 months later. And 2 months after that, the USS Scorpion, one of our attack submarines, went down for some reason. In February of 1968, the USS Pueblo was captured by the North Koreans when they were in international waters. In Vietnam, the Hawaii attacks the Marines went through, the fighting was bloody and went on for days and days and days. And domestically, there were riots, anti-war protests, and the Democratic National Convention had riots against that. So it was terrible. Lyndon Johnson, he said to himself in early 1968, "I can't do this." And so midway through, he said, "I'm not going to run for president this year. Find somebody else." And that's what happened. So all this is part of the backdrop for the Ingram family. Todd Ingram is now a vice admiral. He's running an operation in Hawaii called KSAC, which is almost like a start chamber. I see the pictures, which we have, that tracks all the ships and the tactical situations in the United States Navy and in the opposing forces. So he's doing that. He's close to retirement. His son Jerry, who you visited his birth in 1944 in the Neptune strategy. Well, his son Jerry now is fully grown, mature, attended the Naval Academy, and is now a flight school graduate and is in P3 Orion, ASW aircraft, tracking Russian submarines, as I say, dirty commie rat submarines. So that's what he's doing. The figure of Edouard Dezhnev comes back, and he finally he has a son by a lady he met in earlier, and that son, his boy Vladimir, is posted aboard a submarine called the K-129, and in reality, the K-129 sunk off Hawaii, 1,500 miles northwest, inexplicably, and 16,000 feet of water. To extend the story, it is the Glomar explorer that went after her. The United States discovered it. The Russians had no idea where it was, but our technology was so good, and we were able to find it with SOSUS and other operations that they found it. They built the Glomar explorer, sent down a claw, picked it up. Part of it broke off coming back up, but they were able to find the forward 38 feet of this Russian submarine. And so it's just an amazing operation, which gave us a lot of good intelligence about what the Russians were doing. So it is that story. Jerry Ingram, who has had a tough time in his early years in the Navy because of a love affair. He thought his wife was doing something that she shouldn't have done with somebody else. So he's posted in Hawaii instead of in Sicily. And so the United States, they stick him on a submarine for 45 days just to get rid of him and out of the press and away from telephone calls and everything else. So one night he's up there 1,500 miles northwest with misty weather, and he's on one of the periscopes just kind of helping out, and the captain's on the other periscope, except he's trying to fit the camera on the thing, and suddenly Jerry sees a submarine. It's a Russian submarine, and boom, this thing starts burning like a Bunsen burner. So he's the only one that sees the thing go down. And yes, that's the K-129. And there are hearings subsequent to that. And so the story builds from there, and I hope you enjoy it. So again, thank you for watching. I just want to leave you with one thought about, it's James Michener put it well too, about the American fighting man, the American fighting women, and how the United States seems to come through. As Americans, we always seem to come through, from the love of our country, from the love of our people, the love of one another, our family, that somehow we always find this bond, especially in bad situations, which we've seen recently, and hopefully no more. And as I said, one of the best ways we can think about this is from the book, The Bridges at Tokari, written by James Michener back in 1954, I think it was. And it turned into a very successful movie too. But William Holden, a Navy pilot, goes through all these things, and finally he's shot down and does not make it back. But the story is a beautiful story, and at the very end, Frederick March, the captain of the carrier, learns what's happened to William Holden, and he looks almost directly at the camera, and he says, "Where do we get such men?" It's just amazing. So anyway, once again, thank you for your time, for looking. I hope you enjoyed the books. Bye-bye.